Thanks for tuning into this presentation. You're about to either watch a video or listen to audio recorded at the Grassroots Radio Conference in 2012 at the Independent Media Center in Urbana-Champaign. Please enjoy.
We just got thrown into this fairly recently, and so we haven't planned our mode of attack here quite thoroughly, so you'll have to forgive us if we throw questions back and forth to each other partway through. The topic of this workshop is, it's the journalism. We dropped the word stupid because that...
They asked us to.
But we want to talk about a couple of different things. One is how you do it, and the other is, for lack of a better word, why you do it. And so we'll just talk a little bit about kind of building a news operation. How many people here have stations that are already on the air? How many people have stations that are going on the air soon? And how many people have stations that do local news?
And of those stations, how many of you have well-defined news departments, as opposed to, you know, whenever someone can be there with a microphone to do something?
So there's a lot of different models of how you go about creating a news department, and I think that like everything else, it sort of really depends on your local situation. Who do you have available in your pool of resources? I mean, sometimes you know, communities, especially a community that's maybe connected to a university or near a university or something, will have a lot more resources than somebody that's out in the middle of, you know, rural Colorado or something. But the idea is you want to put together a team of people that will give voice to the local issues of your community, to your listening audience. Now, in some cases that's done through paid staff, in other cases it's done through volunteers. Our station has a local news program that's staffed entirely by volunteers, but we have a paid news director who coordinates that and all of the other news programming. And so in our model, the news director is sort of the watchdog, if you will, of the volunteer programmers, making sure that they adhere to proper journalistic standards, proper technical quality, making sure that there's something to fill that space that we call the news program. You know, a lot of times when you're running a volunteer operation, people can't show up or don't show up, and you've got to sort of scramble to find an engineer, to find a substitute host, to find reporters. So that's our particular structure at our station. I know that some other stations have used our local news program as a model to develop their local news program. But really it all depends on the resources that you have in your community. If you've got you know, a bunch of aspiring journalism students, or if you've got people that are really interested in local politics. We find actually that retirees are a great resource because they have time on their hands, plus they're mature enough to sort of have the skills and responsibility to know that if they commit to coming in on Wednesday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that they'll actually show up and they're not going to get distracted and wander off on another project, or they're not going to have, you know, suddenly have final exams that drag them away. So we find that retirees are a great asset. One of the programs we do is a labor news program, and for that we use predominantly union members who aren't involved in radio in any other way to come in and be the readers. And the model there is that people hear folks like themselves on the radio. You know, somebody that maybe you work in the factory with, or somebody that you deliver mail with, and you hear their voice delivering the news, and it makes the listeners feel much more a part of that program and a part of the station as a whole. In terms of equipment, there's all kinds of stuff out there. Basically, news gathering changed dramatically when small portable digital recorders were invented. And of course, first we had the mini disc, and mini disc recorders are still out there, although the recording medium is much less available. The things that are probably most popular right now are a product called a Zoom recorder, and that's the Zoom H2, which I still think hands down is the best item. The Zoom H4N, this is the older cousin of it, the H4, is great for fixed position recording because it takes XLRs. You can use it in a recording of speech or something like that. But the mics are kind of overly sensitive to wind noise and things like that, so you got to have a good windscreen. Those are much better, in my opinion. The mics on those are much better. There's 4 mics on that little one, by the way. There's only 2 on here. The new Zoom H2N, which somebody had upstairs at the last session, has 5 mics in it. It's a great device. The other one that's come out recently that's pretty hot is this little Tascam recorder here. The mics are actually, I think, a little bit better than what the old H4 has. I haven't tried yours yet. And these are $99. And they have a couple of nice features, like the buttons are real easy. It's very easy to record and pause and start a new track with these. There's also a larger version of this. This is called the DR5. There's a bigger version of this, which a lot of folks use, which does take XLRs as well, and that's probably becoming the most popular of the portable recorders that takes the XLRs. There's a lot of other stuff out there. Basically, digital recording is much nicer than tape because you're not getting the tape noise. The microphone makes all the difference in the world, so if you're using it with an external microphone, get a really good quality mic. I kind of like this guy here. It's a AKG. They use these a lot for instrument mics, but it happens to be also a really good voice mic. It uses a 9-volt battery, so it's a condenser mic. It gets really good quality sound. We've used this. If anybody's seen the film, what's it called? Anyway, this has been used in some films. This particular microphone. It was in Iraq for a while.
AKG, what is it?
It's the AKG C1000. I like it. It's got a nice heft to it. I didn't bring my little extension pole that I made, but I took an old light kit pole and I added an adapter on it so you can get in if you're in a crowd or if you're at a press conference or something like that. Anyway, lots of little things that you can do.
May I interject?
Please.
So one of the most important aspects of news gathering, of electronic news gathering, ENG is the way the TV stations refer to it, is your microphone. And just a couple of things. This is a shotgun. It's the Sennheiser K1 module system. So they sell you the bottom piece, and then you can buy different heads. This is the shotgun head. This is the most expensive microphone I've ever purchased, $500. I'm not suggesting that you buy this mic, but I'll come back to this mic in a minute, why it's become so critical to me. So with the Zoom, 30 years in radio, I never owned a stereo microphone. And I did voice interviews. I never really needed it. Bought this used last year, first stereo microphone, and actually the built-in stereo microphone in this machine is great. What it's very useful for is if I have this set up at a podium where someone's speaking, I'll record in stereo, and if they move back and forth within the stereo field, the way these microphones are oriented, I don't know if you can see sort of a left-right XY pattern, I'm going to get a really, really good recording regardless of whether or not they move in that field. When I get back to the studio, I'm going to turn the stereo recording into mono, pretty much, because for news broadcasts, it's generally done in mono. And just one other thing I wanted to point out is one way I've been covering the Occupy demonstrations in Boston is they have their general assemblies up sort of on a staged, raised area. And what I do is because this is a 4-channel recorder, I plug the shotgun into one of the XLRs, and I record the speaker like that, like here, and I point the stereo microphone behind me to record the mic check. So they'll say something, and then everybody repeats. And so when I get back to the studio, I've got this great, it's a 3-channel mix at this point.
And you could plug in the other side, you could plug in the soundboard feed, and then you'd have...
Yeah, I just don't have enough hands.
But then you mix that down to mono when you get back?
I can, yes.
Well,
a monaural, so it's a left plus right mix. But what the beauty of doing it this way is I have the possibility of at certain points in the piece mixing a little bit more of the stereo ambience behind me, or more of the speaker, depending on what's being said, and especially with Occupy, with the mic check and back and forth, it's so that's one way I've been using it.
So the H2 is a 2-track recording?
H2, which is that one,
is a 2.
is actually has a 4-track capability as well, but with the internal mics, it doesn't have the option that this one has of using the separate inputs.
But even with the 2-track recorders, you can do this, and you just have one on one channel and one on the other channel.
What piece is in your hand? I'm sorry.
This is the H4N.
Okay.
This lists for a little under 300. I got it for 225 used. But again, I'd never owned a stereo microphone before, so that's one of the reasons I brought it up.
So this is the workshop isn't all about equipment, but
Right.
just a couple of other. So the standard microphone that everybody used to use in the old days, we used to call it the Buchanan Hammer, the Electro Voice 635, no, 635A is what I was thinking of, yeah, which is very small, very durable, and you can still pick them up for like $75 on eBay. Excellent microphone. It's a dynamic mic. You can get it either in a cardioid pattern, which is that shape, or in omnidirectional, which is that shape.
Could you repeat that?
Electro Voice 635A.
Which was the standard news gathering microphone.
The reason
for a very
that it
long
was
time.
called the Buchanan Hammer, by the way, was not because you could hammer nails with it, which you could, but because like Sears, which used to advertise the Craftsman hammer, if you break it, they'll give you a new one. Electro Voice used to give you a new one if anything went wrong with it. That is no longer true, unfortunately.
Can I just add one other thing about microphones? In the old days when we were using cassette recorders, a dynamic microphone was quite good. I used the Electro Voice RE50 for almost 20 years. These newer digital recorders need condenser microphones. They have more push, there's more voltage in those microphones. So I never use my RE50 or the 635As anymore. So, for instance, the shotgun, you either use phantom power or a AA battery. And I've tried using the old dynamic microphones on the digital recorders to not great success. So try to remember that you need a condenser is the type of microphone, condenser versus dynamic, and cardioid is the pattern.
The way you'll notice that, like if you're using the H2 with a dynamic mic, is there'll be more noise. There'll be actually like little hits in the background that you don't want. You can strip it out at the editing process. In addition to all this stuff, a lot of people now have moved over to using these. And smartphones actually make tremendous recorders. iPhone is still better than the Android, which is too bad. The Android market has not developed a lot of good recording software, although they're moving in that direction. With the iPhone, there's all kinds of, and I don't have one, all kinds of recording and editing applications that you can get. The thing that we did, and I'm happy to share this, although I didn't bring one with, we designed just a little cable that you can plug into your jack here and use a regular microphone and a regular pair of headphones with your iPhone or Android device. The one thing to be aware of if you build one of those is that because it's capitalism, Sony and HTC use one pattern for the pin out on the plug, and Samsung and some of the other manufacturers use a different pattern for the pin. So if you're going to do it for a news department, you got to make two cables and have them available and color code them so you know which one is which. Just really briefly about Skype. Skype is a tremendously useful tool for recording phone interviews, especially international ones. And I have a whole thing which I didn't bring, but I could throw up on the list here, which is talking about using Skype for remote broadcasting. And I'll just give you two real quick stories about that. One was a show I did when I was in My Lai, Vietnam, for the 40th anniversary of the My Lai massacre. And I was sitting in a hostel with my laptop with Skype. And I got, in Hanoi, and I got a Vietnam veteran who lived in rural Wisconsin on the phone. We conferenced that together, conferenced it into the station, broadcast that over the air, and took live phone calls from listeners all at once. Another one we did was covering the presidential elections in El Salvador in March of 2009. I was sitting in an internet cafe in San Salvador with this thing, which is like a $29 USB headset from Radio Shack. This one's gotten broken, but it still works. And then I had another guy inside the presidential palace with a cell phone, conferenced the two of us together with some folks in the studio back in Madison who were solidarity activists who had been involved in supporting El Salvador during the Civil War, and then we took calls from listeners. So that's the kind of thing that you can do with Skype. There's some other competing technologies now for voice over IP, which is using computers for your phone. Skype is still kind of the one that's best known and most familiar to people. Skype was bought by Microsoft, and Skype is now giving data to Homeland Security, and so they've kind of lost some of their cred. They used to be used by activists all around the globe as a way to communicate without being surveilled, and that's no longer true. But for what we're doing it out in the open anyway, because we're broadcasting it. Editing software, once you gather all this sound, whatever it is, whether you're recording it from Skype or whether you're recording it in your iPhone or whether you're recording it on one of these recorders, you got to do something with it. There's several editing programs out there that people are familiar with. I'm not going to advocate one or another. There's one called Audacity, which is free. It's cross-platform, so you can use it on Linux or Mac or Windows. There's a new version that's just come out, which I actually haven't tried yet, but it has more bells and whistles than the earlier version. And most people find Audacity to be slightly dissatisfying because it doesn't do everything that some of the more sophisticated, expensive programs do. The one that we use is called SoundForge. We use it because it's from Madison. The company started in Madison. We know the people that started it. They gave us the free software. I took it to all the NFCB and GRC conferences in the late 1990s and got everybody addicted to it. Then Sony bought it. So there's one that a lot of people like called Adobe Audition. It used to be called Cool Edit. The Cool Edit program, was it called 2000 or something like that, was a great program. Adobe Audition, I think, is a little bit top-heavy, a little bit complex for radio news use. And then you get into even more complex ones like Pro Tools and things like that. Some people use GarageBand, which comes in your Macintosh iLife suite, and so a lot of people use that. There's also a couple other Mac ones that are out there that John Almello, who's the tech director for Pacifica, really likes Mac stuff, and he recommends a couple different ones. But anyway, that's editing software. Computer technology, just real quickly, almost any computer can do almost anything you want. And so these little small netbooks that you get for, I mean, I just bought this one. It's in here for $100, but you know, a netbook will let you, oh, it's not, it's down here. A netbook will let you edit audio just as well as a, you know, several $1,000 studio PC. The thing you want is as much RAM as you possibly can and as much hard disk space as you possibly can. A lot of the new laptops especially come with card readers, so you record in your little portable recorder, you pop out the card, you plug it in there. It's all very quick and easy. Resources for reporters. There's a bunch of really good stuff up on the web. David has provided a tremendous list. The handouts are going around. If you didn't get one, grab one or two.
Let me just mention one more time now that everybody's here. This 3-page document of web resources and tools and organizations that are very helpful for reporters and journalists is now uploaded to archive.org, and just do a search for journalists tools, and I believe this is the only thing that will currently pop up under that name. And if there's time, we can mention a few of the more funky ones. But but it's loaded in as Creative Commons. You can use it and share it. Please do.
There's two other resource lists that I prepared several years ago. One is a website called independentreports.net, and there's a page called Useful Links for Reporters. I did it in 2003, so some of those links don't work anymore. I apologize, I didn't update it before this conference. The other one is Indytech, INDYTECH.org. I did that at a Grassroots Radio Conference in California in 2004. We were doing a basically tech retreat for community radio journalists and Pacifica folks, and we spent a day, and one of the things we did is we developed this website, indytech.org. So there's a bunch of links on there, manuals, things like that. Again, 2004, so I can't vouch for some of the links are broken, I know. But eventually, sometime soon, we'll assemble those lists and David's list, and it's going to be in the appendix of a book that Crystal and back here and I are working on. So I'll let you know when that's out. And then the last thing, just really quickly, if we're going to talk a little bit about acquiring gear, getting donations and things like that. Basically, just, you know, if people give you stuff, it's great. Make sure it works with everything else you have. It's better if everybody in the department is using the same equipment, because if you have, you know, 10 different volunteers and 10 different recorders, you're going to be doing a lot more support work than if you have one type of recorder that all 10 volunteers can use. Same with computers. If you have, you know, Macs and Linux and Windows all in the same shop, it gets a little confusing and hard to support. So we tend to recommend trying to standardize on something. It doesn't really matter what, but standardize on something that works in your station, and then everybody can learn it and train on it.
And I would add to that, it's critical that people on your staff are using the same microphones, because microphones all sound differently. So unless you want your news reports to sound different, you know, in time, try, if you can, to give everybody who's going out in the field the same microphone.
Well, and also if you have like 2 people in the studio, make sure that they're on the same type of mic. We just had that happen where we had 2 different people using 2 different mics, and it sounded like they were in different rooms.
Right, absolutely.
There's a bunch of other tricks, by the way, really quickly. If you're doing, one great one is if you're doing a phone interview with somebody, and then you get somebody else in the studio, there's going to be a huge difference in the audio quality there. What I actually do is sometimes I throw a phone line effect digitally on top of the person that's in the studio to make them both sound the same. Or you can actually have somebody call in even if they're in the same building, just because it really is jarring to the ear of the listener if you have one person on the phone and one person in the studio. So, relationship with other departments, just really briefly, it's always great if everyone in the station can play nice. There is oftentimes in community radio stations a conflict between music departments and news departments. It tends to be, more than anything else, competition over scarce resources, who gets the most time, who gets the best equipment, and everyone always perceives that the grass is greener on the other side. If you can form relationships where, you know, you have your music DJ come on and do a weekly culture report on your local news show, things like that are really beneficial. And obviously, everybody needs to play nice with the technical staff because they're the ones that make sure that we sound good on the air. I'll toss it to you, David, to talk about journalism and reporting.
Sure. Just want to add on to what Norm was just saying. You want to cultivate an environment at your station where the music producers want to do interviews, okay? Maybe even music features. But the tendency at a lot of stations is the music producers don't get trained on how to put together feature reports. So what you're going to do is you're going to create methods for them to, you're going to create this culture of them wanting to do stories, and then they're going to have to rely on you to show them how to do that stuff, and then you're going to help them think and make them think that you're doing it out of the goodness of your heart. But actually, when you're looking to fill, pieces in your news hour, you could, end your show with a really great music feature. Maybe it's a local band or something that was produced by the music, and it just becomes symbiotic and synergistic, and it's really, really helpful. And be persistent. This stuff happens over time. Not everybody comes to a community radio station thinking they're going to be the next Walter Cronkite. Obviously.
Actually, most people come
myself.
to a community radio station thinking they're going to be the next Walter Cronkite.
Okay, well.
And then they find out.
Now they want to be the next Jon Stewart.
Or Wolfman Jack, possibly. I don't know. I'm really dating myself. So I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can because I think we finish at 2:15, and we want to have at least 15 minutes for Q&A. In terms of staffing your news department, what we do at my station is every time someone joins the station, we sort of poll them and we ask them, for instance, what current event or issue in your community do you think the station should cover? And we try to we compile a list, and then when we want to go cover that, we go right to them and say, you volunteered. We know you did because you said when you first became a member. So, that can generate some, some interest in doing some news that way.
David, you have until 2:45, you're saying.
2:45?
According
oh,
to
okay.
this.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I will then slow down. No, I'm sorry. When you're looking for for more people, keeping the news department at a level where you can support the shows that you have on the air is an ongoing challenge. As we know, throughout the radio industry, departments have been decimated and devastated, and I hold out a lot of hope for community radio to fill niches in towns and cities where the commercial stations certainly are giving up on this. Another place to look for contributors, and don't scoff, but your local daily or weekly newspaper or local commercial TV staff. A lot of these people have always dreamed of having the autonomy to do what they want to do. We can't pay them, but if you invite them to come to the station to do a story, and again, I'm going to date myself. They have the Rolodex with all the sources, right? So that's another way.
We have people from the public radio station that come over to us and say, I've always wanted to.
Exactly.
And the interesting thing is in some eras of management, their managers won't let them
Right.
have their voice on air. In other eras, they've been more forgiving about that. The other thing is, Todd's gone, I guess, but the station in western Wisconsin very early on set up a relationship with the daily or weekly local paper in this small town in Wisconsin, where the paper itself was kind of dying. You know, it was a small town rural newspaper, but the staff there would come over and do the local news on the community radio station, and that kind of reinvigorated the newspaper, as well as providing a source of trained people to do community news in that area as that station was starting up. So that's the kind of partnership you could form.
Yeah, I mean, forming those partnerships can be very important. Not to overwhelm the volunteer staff at your station. I'm suggesting these as I'll get to you in a moment, as tools to help you when in need. Yes.
Just at KYRS in Spokane, Washington, we have regular interviews that our news volunteers do of the paid journalists at the daily and weekly. So they're not even producing a report for us. We're simply just saying, so you have a feature story this week on drones, let's talk about it. Because that's the least resource intensive, to simply just ask a journalist to talk about their story, vocally instead of.
You had a feature story on drones in the local paper in Spokane.
Oh yeah.
That's great.
You want to move there now?
We have two people here who were students and worked on the student newspaper at one of the colleges in Madison, and they had a feature on our station where they did a weekly story about something that was also in the paper, and that was another kind of partnership that we were able to form.
Ursula, did you get it?
What is the credit etiquette? I mean, we've had people from the local online newspapers say they want to work with us, but they say they want to credit it to their papers. So when you interview a paper or you have them on your, what is the etiquette in terms of crediting the news organization?
Well, I think you're asking a multi-layered question there. If it's if you're interviewing them for a public affairs show, then they'll tell you how to attribute them. I mean, this is Sally Smith from the Daily Tribune or whatever. If they're actually producing a report for the station, I think the standard out cue is the station's call letters. For WXYZ, I'm Sally Smith. Does that answer your question?
Well, the way we did it with the Clarion, the student
Yeah.
paper, was we branded it as the Clarion Clips, right? So they came
Okay.
on and they had a little
So
theme
that's
music and they had an intro.
That's a
and-
real partnership.
Yeah,
That's a
and
real
then they
partnership.
were getting the props of being on the radio, and we were getting the content in that interactive relationship.
So you could theoretically do their report and at the end say, this report was provided by.
Well, what was the wording? Do you remember?
There was something at either the beginning or the end during the music that said this report was done by, the Clarion newspaper, Madison area technical college students that, worked with the newspaper. So.
There's no restrictions on this unless it's a call to action. If it's not a call, right, these are all not educational, non-commercial stations. If it's not a call to action to subscribe to the local Clarion,
Right.
there's no restrictions, and it's up to the individual news director or news department to figure out exactly what to do about it.
Let's just taking off from this
Sure.
for 1 second off our agenda, but
Sure.
crediting, some stations read from the local newspaper on air, and just to be very clear, that's plagiarism.
Right.
And people need to be aware of that you can't just sit there and read the story out of the local paper. We had a volunteer one time who thought he was being a big help. He wrote to all the local newspapers and said, please provide us a free subscription because then we'll read from your paper every day. And they wrote back and said, why would you survive off of our paying our staff and so on. So attribution and credit is important.
Right.
And
Now, having said that, I listen to Morning Edition pretty frequently because WBUR is the flagship station of the NPR system, and it's in Boston. half to 3/4 of the stories on the local news that BUR does are generated out of the Boston Globe. They always credit the Boston Globe reported that. Very important. It's very ethical and it's very important. Yes.
Yeah, sometimes I will quote from the New York Times, but I attribute it right away.
Absolutely.
So but how much can you do before, you don't want to read the whole story, but just pull a couple sentences out and then attribute it or?
That's up to you and how you design your show. I mean, I've heard some shows where they read entire articles. It's not the sort of thing I do.
Yeah.
But what I'll generally do is attribute at the beginning and at the end of the clip that I read.
We have a third world news program that we do where we use a lot of international press sources, and we tell the people that are writing the stories to try and use at least 3 different sources and attribute. So if you say, according to a report in the New York Times, General so-and-so said such and such, then you write some of your own stuff, and then you say, in the Bangladesh Herald, it was noted that, so that way you're using multiple sources in one story. You're attributing everything that's coming from those stories, especially quotes. And then you're also writing your own stuff, around it to package that for your audience.
You don't want to say a certain source said and not say to whom, because they didn't say it to you. Right? One other thing is the firewall between business and editorial. The one tricky thing with our relationship with the Alternative News Weekly in town is we have trade partnerships with them where we get ads in the paper and they get airtime to underwrite. Because of that relationship, it's really important that there's no perception of and no actual activity where they're telling me which stories I'm going to run on our news program. So, for example, I had a writer who I trust there say, I have a great story coming out on Thursday, you want to interview me about it? And I said, well, not until I read the story, right? So it's really important that somebody at your station, whether you have a news director or a volunteer or whoever, is making that decision for the station, and you're not letting someone else dictate what your content's going to be, even if you have a good relationship, particularly in a situation where there's an underwriter.
Right. Can you hold your question just for 1 minute? I just want to quickly get through a couple of more sources for people, and I'll take your question and then we'll skip to another section. But high school students, high school journalism programs. College students, college journalism programs. They are looking for bylines and they are looking for experience. That's another great place to find people. Access TV staffs. I don't have a lot of experience contacting Access TV, but that's another place. And I also had on my list community centers like IMC. So those are some suggestions for finding people.
We've
Yes.
done co-productions with Access TV,
Yeah.
by the way, where they
Right.
simulcast our news, so like our election coverage. They'll throw a camera in our studio, we'll stream it to their website, then they'll broadcast it on their cable access, so we do a co-production in that way.
I was just going to mention as well that a lot of publications, a growing number of publications are actually starting to produce audio content of their own.
Yes.
One of the more interesting examples is The Economist, which is now hiring essentially retired newsreaders to read the text of their articles. They put that up on SoundCloud now, and that's it. And
But it's probably not licensed for broadcast unless you have an
you have to talk to
agreement with them.
Exactly. But what I was mentioning was that what they're doing is they're taking the entire article and reading it, and there's no reason why a local publication couldn't do the same thing as well. I mean, with permission, and once you work out the right rights for that. One other really interesting trend that I am seeing as well is the publication Monocle, which actually has its own 24-hour radio station online. And what they're doing is that they actually skip to they interview their own journalists about their stories. So they're, the writers, hey, you just went to this design fair, why don't you tell us about it? And they'll fill that out for, a half hour talking about the stories. And it's a great source of, meta information about the piece.
Well, that's a great segue, because I was going to jump now to some of the nuts and bolts of journalism, of doing journalism. And my first thing that I was going to talk about is called cultivating sources. And I just want to say that in general, news entities allow their reporters who are covering a particular story to talk about it with other journalists. And so that's another way of bringing people into your station for two ways, for interviews or for news stories. And I just want to add one quick thing. A lot of, Norm had mentioned engaging public radio news departments to help you. A lot of those public radio reporters, where did they come from? Pacifica, community radio, that's where they started. Anyway, cultivating sources. So, you're working on a story, and you realize that you need to speak to let's just say, a city councilor. The city councilor, whether he or she agrees or does not agree to talk with you, always ask, to whom else can I speak to about this issue? And I'm not the most organized person in the world, but I'll tell you that having a computer around or a smartphone has been helpful. Always list names that people give you. Don't forget to get contact information, of course. We used to keep, individual reporters used to keep Rolodexes on their desk. Nowadays, you can share on Facebook, well, maybe not on Facebook, but you can share in a Google Doc, let's say, lists, and you can arrange them by topic or however way you want to do it, but always ask, to whom else should I speak to? So cultivating sources is very important. I'm going to go through this, not necessarily in any particular order, and some of this is relatable to each other, but one of my bullet points was fairness/seeking other viewpoints. I believe that the only way to be credible to your listeners, to your audience, is to seek out other viewpoints. Yes, a lot of us come from the activist community, and we got into radio because we had a particular mission in mind. And earlier today, Betty Yu said it's a means to an end. Okay, it's important to understand that, but I'm a journalist first. I'm not an activist. Now, I've been accused of being an activist journalist and a journalist activist, but I'm a journalist first. And when I cover demonstrations, I don't cross over and participate in the demonstration. I invite the activists to talk to me. And in terms of seeking other viewpoints, it's all about doing due diligence and trying to find, other sides. Now, I've never believed in there's two sides. I've always believed in there's multiple sides. So if I can, I seek out as many different viewpoints as possible. This is fair. Okay, we used to have something called the fairness doctrine. At my station, we try to toe to the fairness doctrine, whether it's codified and or not. But we try to seek out other viewpoints. In spite of the fact that you're on deadline, that you don't have a lot of resources, if you pick up the phone and you try to call, and you don't get a response by your deadline, you say in your story, we tried to contact so-and-so, they were unavailable, or they declined to talk to us, but it's all about your due diligence. And due diligence is related to research, so you have to know what all the sides in a particular story are saying. One way I gather that kind of information is that I never unsubscribe from listservs. Now, I get a ton of listservs. My favorite right now is the Committee to Defeat Barack Obama. Okay? They're awful, but I want to know what they're saying, and they're a potential source. Although I haven't interviewed anybody from there yet.
I want to say one
Yes,
other thing while
yes,
you're
yes.
looking on there.
Yeah,
To me, this whole myth of objectivity as it's presented in journalism schools, and the notion of both sides of every story. I used to like to say, the New York Times, we cover up both sides of every story. But most stories have lots more than one side. And all of us as journalists come into a situation with a particular set of blinders, a particular set of glasses. I mean, in my case, I like to say it's, white male raised in the late 20th century North American school system, right? I come into every situation with that. And so what you have to do is you have to acknowledge your bias, you have to acknowledge your blinders, your glasses, and you have to be fair and honest and give voice to the people whom you are interviewing. So, if you go out and you interview somebody, you don't color what they're saying based on what you're seeing. You allow their voice to come out through the piece, and that is what fair journalism is about. It's not this mythical J-school notion of objectivity.
There's a meme that's been developing over the last couple of years that says transparency is the new objectivity. There's still debate going on in journalism circles about what exactly that means, but as Norm points out, it's very important to disclose. Disclosure is very important. Yes?
Well, I mean, if we're speaking as journalists, even in the elements of journalism, the book, it says objectivity is not this thing about do we have a bias or not. Objectivity is the objectivity of method. So are we following the standard method of research verification, more research, more verification, interviews? I mean, that's what we have to follow.
Yes.
We all pursue, we can be activists in the issues we pursue, but in the method we pursue, we have to be journalists.
Right.
So I think maybe that's the objectivity that we have to abide by.
You're demonstrating some bias in the stories that you choose, and I think and that's fine. And I think community radio is so important because we're covering stories that are not covered or not uncovered, whatever, by other media entities.
The unrepresented and underrepresented, I think, is the sort of the watchword of what we're trying to.
Exactly, but you bring the same journalistic principles to covering those stories. Bring your experiences and your biases to the story, but don't flaunt them on air. Okay, that you're gonna lose credibility if you do that. And I think something that you mentioned reminded me that fact checking is very important. Fact check and fact check again.
There's a great Robert Heinlein novel where there's this one class of people in the society who are professional witnesses. And so you'd say, oh, is that house white? And they'd say, well, it's white on this side.
How many of you, when you're researching something, go to Wikipedia first? Be honest, I do. Okay. How many of you trust Wikipedia to be completely factual? Okay, you shouldn't trust it to be your end-all and be-all. In fact,
how many of you scroll down to the bottom of the Wikipedia page first? I mean, I find it a great aggregator.
Right.
But it's the links that you follow that are
universities all over the country have outlawed their students from citing Wikipedia in their reports. So that's just something to keep in mind. But it's a great source to start with. In terms of transparency, other issues include, avoiding conflict of interest. So don't send a reporter who has more than a 50% stake in a particular company to cover that company. I mean, don't send a staffer out to cover something if their wife works for the. I mean, there's a whole. I could go on and on and on. But
what if they give you
think about
tickets?
conflict of interest.
So why give you free tickets?
Yeah, well, that's a problem. That could be a conflict of interest. Yes.
I'm wondering how that sort of dovetails with the idea that Norm brought up earlier about our labor notes program, where it's actually read by the workers that it's covering. So I would say that is absolutely a conflict of interest that you're talking about. But
although
I'm
for
not
instance,
offended by it.
for instance, in that program, we have a woman who works on the show who is a member of WEAC, which is the teachers union. She won't do teachers union stories. She'll do stuff about the plumbers or the postal workers. Somebody else will do that. And the people that are reading the stories, the hosts that are reading the stories, they begin the show by saying, I'm a member of local, 2448 of the AFT. I'm a member of AFSCME Local 60. So they'll start by saying that, so they identify themselves right at the top of the show, and then the stuff that they're reading has been written by other reporters. So that's how we justify that.
That's a great question, because that dovetails really well with disclosure. You have to say who you're affiliated with. Look, it's an organic process. NPR wouldn't even send people to cover the big Stephen Colbert rally in DC, because they were afraid their reporters would have their own brains and minds, and they were afraid they would laugh. And somebody from the, what's the conservative paper in Washington? Not the Post. Washington Times would see them laughing at Stephen Colbert. Here, in community radio.
Like talking points.
Colbert gave a Medal of Freedom to a little girl on stage and said, "You're braver than NPR."
I mean, but it's constantly shifting. Community radio, I think, as a if it could be monolithic, like anything else, I think has come to the conclusion that this transparency is the new objectivity, and along with disclosure, works. That it's still credible, and it avoids some of the problems we've talked about. Obviously, know the difference between opinion and editorial. I'm not exactly sure what the rules are in regards to whether non-commercial stations can editorialize. I don't think we really can. But public affairs shows, talking heads kind of things, they push the envelope in terms of opinion versus editorial. That's something that every station kind of has to get a feel for. Again, the rules about disclosure come into that.
It also
as
depends
well.
on your nonprofit status.
Sure.
Editorializing as a 501c3 is a little bit different than editorializing when you're not.
So I have a couple telling quotes, and I don't know who said this first, but I heard Governor Deval Patrick of Massachusetts say this in the context of talking about the healthcare reform bill. He was very upset about how people across the country were, referring to death panels and Obama's murdering children in their beds because of healthcare reform. And Governor Patrick said, everyone is entitled to their own opinion. No one is entitled to their own facts.
Daniel Moynihan said it first.
Did Daniel Moynihan say that?
Go back to
Okay,
the
great. So it's not surprising that Patrick, a Democrat, got it from Moynihan. So that's something to think about. Back in the late '80s, I was covering. Actually, it was a journalism conference at the Harvard Kennedy School, circa 1988, and Carl Bernstein was there. You all know Woodward and Bernstein. And Carl Bernstein said something that has stuck with me forever and ever, which is it's the role of the reporter or the investigative reporter to find the best available version of the truth. The best available version of the truth. Okay, so that it's multi-layered in there. You're going to do your best. You're going to do your due diligence, and be aware that stories evolve over time. So if you don't get it completely the first time, hopefully you have the facility and the capacity to cover things over time. And I also want to say that it's important to admit when you got something wrong. We don't have one at my community radio station, but some places have an ombudsman, so that the listener, if the listener wants to comment on a story and say, I don't think you got that right, most newspapers, NPR has a very important ombudsman, can weigh in because they're kind of the most objective person in that institution, and they're not afraid to criticize the news department if they get it wrong. I want to just get through a couple of quick things, and we want to open it up for Q&A. Very important to build an archive of all the stories you've done. So some of you folks are going to be part of new radio stations. I imagine some of you will be part of some of these new LPFMs. Archive everything. It used to be you had a closet with spider webs, and you had the 12-inch reel-to-reel tapes. Actually, some of those may last longer than some of these computer files, which the Library of Congress decided after doing a 10-year report that, anyway, that's a problem. But there's no reason you shouldn't be archiving everything. Yes, go ahead quickly.
To add to that?
Yes.
Metadata.
Yes.
It sounds really geeky, but if you're searching for stuff 6 months in the future, 12 months in the future, if you don't describe it in ways that you can retrieve it later, you're going to have a really hard time with interview1.wav. Oh, what was that? On that date.
I'm going back now and I'm digitizing old reel-to-reels. One of my biggest challenges is that the tape, not the tape, the adhesive tape, the scotch tape that I used to put the label, it's all falling apart after 25 years. And so I have to listen to the whole reel and just figure out what's on there.
What I usually use for digital file names is the name of the person you interviewed, the date of the interview, right in the file name, and then maybe the topic. Robert Smith on healthcare, 7/27/2012.
If you have to abbreviate because your word processor doesn't allow, your operating system doesn't allow long strings, just maybe keep a list of all the abbreviations.
Yeah. But also one quick trick, if you're switching between platforms like Windows, Mac, Linux, don't use spaces in file names. This is a big pet peeve of mine. You can use capital letters, so capital John, capital Smith, but no space between the John and the Smith. It's just it's safer when you're popping back and forth between different operating systems.
One reassuring thing is the new version of Word is not going to be compatible with any of the back versions.
Well, that's
I hate Microsoft.
That's capitalism.
Anyway, just a couple of other quick things. Be as local as you can. I personally think local community radio is going to save the industry as everything falls apart around us in commercial radio, and I also in terms of having hope and change. I mean hope. Think about all the weather that we've had in the United States. I mean, in Massachusetts alone, in the last 12 to 18 months, we had an earthquake. We had a tornado that almost destroyed Springfield, Massachusetts, and the usual blizzard and a hurricane. And people go to their terrestrial radio first, studies have shown.
Well, and in fact, with that big power outage that you guys had on the East Coast, where the internet was down in a lot of sectors, before you get too far away from that.
I'm about done.
Okay. Well, I want you to talk about the covering versus participating. And then I want to talk about the NPR versus community radio.
Okay, well, I think I talked a little bit about covering versus participating. And this goes back to this Colbert Stewart events that NPR wouldn't let their reporters go to. But I have no problem if the people around me are participating in something, but they're not going to cover that as a story. Now, in journalism circles, in traditional journalism circles, they'll say, well, that reduces the credibility of that particular reporter. But it's all about building trust with your listeners. And if your reporters are covering stories, researching the story, looking for different viewpoints, doing their due diligence, and writing compelling stories, you will, and getting out into the community. We didn't really talk about that. There should be opportunities at your stations for the news staff to get out and interact with your listeners and the greater community. Music staffs do this all the time at concerts and all sorts of things. But your news staff should do that a little bit too. That will build trust. When you're covering a story, the Occupy Wall Street stuff is a good example. You can't jump over and start holding a sign and doing that sort of thing. The closest I get is if the police are forcibly arresting someone and hurting someone, I'll get in there with my microphone. I'll try to interview the officer and why are you doing this? And in many cases, and about 45 reporters were arrested around the country as a result of covering Occupy. you may risk arrest. But I never step over that line between covering and participating. Yes?
I had a mentor many years ago who really drummed it into our heads, a very simple statement. When you become part of the news, you're no longer a reporter. And when you start acting out, you're supposed to be an observer and report. That's what you're supposed to do.
Well, sometimes you become part of the story
as a result.
If you're arrested,
Right,
yeah, exactly.
Right, or getting
Right.
arrested.
Right.
But it is as a journalist, you are supposed to observe and report. And the minute you step over that line, and you become part of that story, is when your credibility goes out the window.
Yes.
Part of the appeal of why I got into community radio and just community media in general was because I felt like it was more active journalism. I felt like I could be, obviously we use first person with story, but I just agree slightly with that statement because that's why I never wanted to go to conventional media. I couldn't see myself just being this just this fly on the wall, this objective, the hypothetical objective reporter. I felt like I could still be passionate about the issues.
Absolutely.
Now at the same time, I see that there's a very hairy line of crossing over and actually participating in the movement.
This is where I wanted to go in talking about sort of the difference between commercial news and NPR news and community radio news, because I think it's an important distinction. Commercial radio puts news on the air for one simple purpose. They want to get more listeners so they can charge more to their advertisers. So news is used as infotainment. And that's why you have, the news usually includes, traffic on the 8s and weather on the 11s and whatever, because they think that'll draw listeners to their station, and then they turn around to their advertisers and they up the price. NPR has a very different news philosophy, and the NPR news philosophy is basically the more you know about stuff, the better of a person you will be. And this is, it's a good liberal news philosophy, but it has the same failing as the game Trivial Pursuits. Everything has the same value. So Susan Stamberg's cranberry sauce recipe gets as much airtime as how many people were killed in Iraq. In community radio, I argue that we have a different philosophy, and that philosophy is giving people information about issues that affect their lives and tools to become active around those issues. And so the way that plays out in real life, I always like to use the example of this cheese warehouse fire in Madison in 1994. So there's this cheese warehouse. So how does the commercial radio? Big flames, big fire. NPR says, well, we're a statewide network and we don't really think that our listeners in Poynette or Rhinelander will care about that thing in Madison. Community radio is, well, what about the people that worked in the factory? Were they evacuated? Were there toxic fumes? Is there a neighborhood evacuation? Where do people go to get resources? Is the Red Cross doing something about this? Does the city council have something? So those are the ways that we cover a story as community radio journalists. It's about information about issues that affect people's lives and tools to become active around those issues.
And I'm a huge advocate of bringing your passion to the story. This is an issue that there's tension over it at stations, and there's an ongoing tug of war. I think every individual, every department, and every station kind of has to find the right place for them. I have concluded that I have to protect my credibility and the trust that I've earned from listeners. So I do certain things, but I don't do certain things.
Great story about that. In Wisconsin, we just had a recall election. And in order to stimulate the recall election, there was a recall petition, and people signed the recall petition. And they put the recall petitions up on the web. And then all the right-wing groups went and they looked and they saw, well, which reporters signed the recall petition. And then they attacked those, mostly newspapers, and they said, your reporters are, advocates here. Now, I personally did sign the recall petition, and the way I justified the difference, because I won't sign a candidate's nomination papers and I won't give money to a particular candidate. But I saw, in my own mind, signing the recall petition was simply signing a document that said, there should be an election. It wasn't advocating a result in that election. Now, you know, other people may take other points of view, and certainly the right that attacked these newspapers took a different point of view. But I think that you need to make those distinctions very clear in your mind and adhere to whatever system you develop, and then you can defend your position if challenged.
Another quick example is when people approach me and say, we're just trying to get candidate X on the ballot, I'll sign that. It's just ballot access. But I avoid signing issue-oriented petitions because I'm a little afraid of this situation. Now, I have very clear political viewpoints, and that comes through in part based on the stories that I cover.
Now, I won't even sign to get candidate X on the ballot because then the way it works is, at least in Wisconsin, you can't sign anybody else's petition, so it does become an ad. But that's just me.
It's a line you have to straddle.
Continuing what I was saying before, also another thing is like I understand that I wear different hats as like a professional versus my personal life. I'm not going to compromise what I feel strongly about. There are going to be marches that I attend and participate in. I may not report on them. Probably, yeah, right, exactly. But I'm not ashamed to be seen in the streets by the people that are listening to my reports.
Right.
I mean, throw a little fuel on the fire here. I actually don't see a problem with reporting on a march that you're participating in, so long as you say, hey, this story is coming from a participant in the march. Like, if you tell that and you say, hey, this is how I was participating and this is how I was going about it, and there's a publication that's going to take that story from you, or, you know, a community radio station, I actually don't see any ethical problem with that unless you try to cover up where you're coming from. Then there's a problem if you're lying to people about your perspective and stuff. But if people want to read a story that's written by someone that participated in a march because it's a different perspective on the same story that everyone's writing, I actually don't know that I see too much of an issue with that as long as you're open about it.
I write for an online news publication called Open Media Boston, and when people post, they have to choose one of 4 categories. Okay, so my category is staff. We have a participant category, and it's clearly in the byline. I don't consider that journalism. So I'm not going to stop you from doing what you do, but I'm going to disagree on what we call it.
Well, I would argue there's a difference between writing a story for a magazine about your experience and doing a news report about an event.
And I wouldn't call that a news report, you know?
Sure.
Like it would be a different thing to me, but I don't see an ethical consideration.
Are you ready to
open it up?
Let's open it up to Q&A and have a discussion. I saw your hand first.
I do want maybe you to spend a couple minutes on what we should be concerned about, you know, warned about with the upcoming elections in terms of covered what's kosher, what's not. But before that, I just wanted to get back on the thing about editorializing. How we handle this is kind of a semantic thing that we, I guess, we define editorializing as the station itself taking a position. And so as long as an individual programmer disclaims that this is not the opinion of the station and staff, the board, and all that, then we allow that. Is that, are we?
The way that we do it at our station is similarly, we don't muzzle our programmers, but we ask them to state that it's their personal opinion, not the opinion of the whatever. It's not a good idea for your programmers, even if they state that, to endorse a candidate on your airwaves, because that's a whole separate animal, right? Yeah. Endorsing of candidates. The other thing is we allow programs to editorialize, like the Third World View program might do an editorial about a topic, not a partisan electoral issue, but a topic, the flood in, Thailand or whatever. And certainly, when you have guests on the air and they speak their opinion or their advocacy for issues or whatever, you want to say, that's your opinion, that's the guest's opinion, not the opinion of the station. As a station, we don't editorialize as the station, and we have a statement, we say, WRT doesn't have opinions, our listeners do. And that's the way that we handle that terrain.
Okay. And then as far as election stuff?
Well, could you be a little more specific?
Well, I mean, if you have a candidate on the air, what's the equal access and that kind of thing? And
the way the FCC rules work on this, and it's changed in recent years, The actual thing called the equal access provision was struck down because there were only two candidates who ever used it, to my knowledge, in the history of community radio against community radio stations. One was Lyndon LaRouche, the other was Ralph Nader. When Ralph Nader used it, all of a sudden they vacated the rule. The equal access provision used to say that a candidate for federal office could get on the air at the least cost rate, which is in community radio free. There is still the provision that says if you have a candidate's voice on the air, and it doesn't matter if they're talking about peanut butter or if they're talking about the election, if you have a candidate's voice on the air, then you have to put something in your public file which says we had this candidate on the air, this amount of time, this program, blah, blah, blah. And then the other candidates are able to come to the station, look in your public file. If they see that candidate was on, then they can request time. But you don't have to call them up and say, hey, we had your opponent on, do you want to come on? And there's no provision there. So the form is very important, and I'm happy to share a copy of it with anybody that wants. But it's very important to file that, and we do it for any candidate that's on the air, even if they're on a program that's what they call exempt. Like if it's what they call a bona fide news program, if it's your local evening news and you're out at a rally and the candidate is speaking and you get their voice on there, that's actually exempt from this public file requirement. But because it's such a shifty territory to figure out which is which, it's much easier to just say anytime a candidate's voice is on the air, file one of these forms in your public file. They don't have to stay in there for 2 weeks. And they have 2 weeks to come and see it and ask for equal time. But anyway, so that's the way that works. And anytime you have a candidate's voice on the air, put it in your public file. It's a good practice to always try and invite all of the candidates on an issue. So, city council race, school board, those are pretty easy. If it's somebody running for senator or governor, it's going to be a little bit trickier to get everybody to come into your station and be on the noontime call-in show. But it can be done sometimes. If you're covering, one particular race, try and give. One way that we do it is if we don't get them all in the station at the same time, we have this week we profile this candidate, this week we profile that candidate, and so on up to election time. So that's some ways of doing it.
City council elections in Boston can be free-for-alls, so there's some citywide seats, and often 10 or more people will run. So what we've done is we've invited all of them, and what we've done is we've turned it into a public forum, and generally not live, but we've generally recorded it for later broadcast. Some of them come, some of them don't. But as Norm pointed out, we put that information in the public file, and we have space for them, for the others to come later. Yeah.
And a method that we've used in Mexico for that was to actually publish the notice of the public forum, and you put that in your public file as well. And with the moderator, everybody has 3.5 minutes, and there's your balance of time. And I still fall back on the equal time thing, and I encourage it because it brings great radio. And so while that may not be the full requirement now, it makes great radio. And so I still.
We've also partnered with other groups.
Right.
To broadcast their debates. So like League of Women Voters did a debate, and we took a bunch of equipment over there and set up, and Mike did ourselves and broadcast the debate live at the same time as it was happening in the public library. And we went to the mayor's candidates debate that was in some theater, and we did the same thing. We got a feed off the board and we broadcast it live. So that's another way is partnering with other groups that are already doing debates. Plus it increases the profile of your station.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Kind of back to this issue of standards for journalism, and I don't know where I fall in every sense, but and I don't want to bring up an example of corporate and NPR doing something, so it's okay if we do something the other way. But on the other hand, it seems that they have this kind of false pretense of a standard, but liberals get hyper picked apart. And one thing that really struck me is every time there's a threat to CPB funding and so forth, all the NPR and PBS, they get all defensive and they say we're not liberal, and they do the programming that kind of proves it. And in Kansas City, we have one of the 6 CPB board members, outgoing manager of the NPR affiliate, come on the air on one of these most recent times and said, you know, and then the host asked, is NPR liberal? And she says, well, you know, I remember when NPR first started, one of the first things All Things Considered did was cover a Vietnam War protest. And when I listen to that now, it sounds kind of liberal, but just as I'm not 20-something anymore, the station is now 40-something, so we're so, and that's pretty close to quote, but paraphrasing now, it's like, we're so mature now, we don't cover war protests. And, you know, I don't know that I want NPR to be liberal. I want them to give them important information and have that be the mission, not, oh my God, we have to be non-liberal or we'll lose our funding. They'll probably lose their funding anyway if that's all the value.
I heard a very interesting interview with, of all people, Susan Stamberg. And Susan Stamberg told the interview, of course we're liberal. Conservatives exist to conserve and preserve the status quo. Liberals exist to challenge the status quo. We're journalists, we challenge. Susan Stamberg. Now, she's probably on the outs at NPR. She's probably not, part of the decision making. But that really stuck with me.
Yeah. Well, I want to say something about the attacks on CPB funding, because I think this is these are actually very serious and need to be responded to. In 1995, when Newt Gingrich went after funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, we wrote a letter at the time that said something to the effect of, not only should they not cut funding, but they should increase funding, because community radio is an essential component of a free and democratic society, because we're the ones that provide for an educated listening audience who, in a democratic system, are supposed to make informed choices and convey their, sentiments to their elected officials, blah, blah, blah. At that time, Big Bird and Reading Rainbow saved funding for CPB.
Yeah, that's true.
That is no longer the case. They no longer have the kind of cachet that they had in 1995. And between the push from the right to say, oh, you should, Sesame Street should be like Barney, you should have your spin-off of products that will support your programming. And the fact that most people in Congress confuse CPB and NPR. Most people in Congress think that we have to cut funding for NPR because they're too liberal, so they cut CPB. Well, that affects all the rest of us that are doing so many different things in our local communities that aren't NPR. And finally, I can't not complain about the fact that President Obama and both sides of Congress were tremendously deceived and ill-informed about the PTFP,
Right.
Public Telecommunications Facilities Program, which nobody, and I talked to a couple of different senators about this, nobody could get through their minds the fact that PTFP and CPB were not duplicate services, that PTFP provided small stations like ours, low power city, right. PTFP provided to stations that were not eligible for CPB funding. They still got equipment through PTFP. And so that was a tremendous loss. We will not see that come back again. And it was a failure on our part to not be able to convey that properly to our elected officials.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree we should have more CPB funding, and I can understand the fear of losing the funding, and we did lose the PTFP, but I don't think the answer is being so defensive.
Circle the wagons, right. CPB, by the way, for those of you that aren't CPB stations, in addition to the direct funding, you get all kinds of other support, like they pay your broadcast licensing fees for music, they pay your internet streaming fees, so it's a pretty big hit for those of us that are CPB recipients if that program disappeared. It's more than just the money.
Well, thank you. Looks like we're out of time. Thank you so much. just quickly, a reminder, archive.org, and then search for journalists' tools, and you'll find the 3 pages of interesting websites and tools for journalists.
A couple of us have put it up on the Twitter as well.
Great, excellent, excellent.
I guess just going around and everybody.
Good job.
Yeah, anything that's left, we'll put upstairs on the lit table for anybody else that wants it too. So.
We did in a short amount of time. I have just one sort of friendly amendment to this idea about NPR giving stories equal value. Based on their clock, they will always do the most important international story first. You've been watching or listening to a presentation recorded at the Grassroots Radio Conference 2012 at the Indie Media Center in Urbana, Champaign. Thanks.